Okay, good morning, everybody. This is Lou Huger. We're sitting here right at 11 o'clock, so we're going to go ahead and get started. We have almost exactly an hour-long presentation today, so we are in a little bit of a tight timeline. So anyways, good morning. Like I said, my name's Lou Huger. I have a bunch of familiar faces in our attendees today, so I think almost everybody in here has seen or met me at one point, but I'm located here in Boise, Idaho, working for the University of Idaho Extension Office. I teach commercial produce safety, basically the Food Safety Modernization Act produce safety rules statewide. Today, I'm not going to be doing a lot of talking actually, because we do have a specialist in the house that's going to be talking about pest management on the farm. So let's go ahead and get started. So just a couple of housekeeping items. I know that with the state of the world currently, most of us are pretty used to the Zoom platform, but for those of us that are tuning in and maybe haven't been on the webinar just yet, here's a couple of reminders and things you can do to kind of get better bandwidth and a little bit more quality out of our presentation today. So try to, first of all, close any other programs you may have running on your computer. That'll help you save bandwidth to run Zoom. If you start to have any types of connectivity or sound issues, you can go ahead into your email, and I have sent you a link that got you into this, but then also at the bottom will have a call-in number that you can get audio that way. As we're moving along, if you have any questions, go ahead and put those into the chat. I see that Ariel just said that if you have any questions at the end, we're going to have a question and answer panel that hopefully will have a couple of minutes to address some questions. At the end of this webinar, I will be sending around a copy of the slide deck. So if you have any questions with that, just know that we will have hard copies for you at the end. And then I'd also like to make a quick mention that this webinar and the question and answer at the end will be discussing not specifically the produce safety rule, but today we're going to be talking about pest management, which is something that's part of the produce safety rule, but we won't be talking about anything COVID-19 related with produce safety questions, just to keep that in mind. So I know most of us here today have been through some type of curriculum having to do with the produce safety rule. So I'm just going to give you a really quick overview of what FSMA is, just to give some context of why we're here today. So basically FSMA, or the Food Safety Modernization Act for long, was signed into law on January 4th of 2011. This basically gives the FDA the authority to regulate food from farm to fork for the first time in history, essentially. These were the first sweeping food safety regulations that have come out in the United States since 1938. And basically this served to create the first science-based minimum standards for the growing, harvesting, packing, and holding of fresh fruits and vegetables for human consumption. And it's also important to note that not all farms are covered by the produce safety rule. At this point, most people that have been through our classes hopefully have a good idea of whether they're covered or not. But if you still are unsure, we do have a really great website. I have the link down here at the bottom of this page, which I'll send out at the end of the webinar. And we have some great resources to try to figure out if and how you are covered by the produce safety rule. So just to give today a little bit of context, we are going to be talking about basically produce safety rule pest related requirements, because in the produce safety rule, we have these requirements with monitoring for pests, but we don't really have a lot of curriculum that focuses on the how of doing that. So just to give you guys a brief refresher for most of us, basically pests and buildings are going to be housed in the subpart L, equipment, tools, buildings, and sanitation part of the produce safety rule. So when we're thinking about this, basically what the rule says is that you must take those measures reasonably necessary to protect covered produce, food contact surfaces, and food packing materials from contamination by pests and buildings, which includes routine monitoring for pests, which is what we're going to be talking about today, as necessary and appropriate. And the way that the rule breaks this down within buildings is that you have basically two different ways. One is in fully enclosed buildings and one is in partially enclosed buildings, and they have different requirements. So for fully enclosed buildings, you must take measures to exclude pests from your buildings. And then in partially enclosed buildings, meaning those that have 3 walls and they aren't fully enclosed, you must take measures to prevent pests from becoming established in your buildings. Basically, you know, they can kind of come in and out just because you do have an opening and it is outside, and animals are natural in our environment, but basically they're not becoming fully established. And you can do this by the use of screens, for example, and for monitoring for the the presence of pests and removing them when present. So we're going to be talking mostly about fully enclosed buildings and habitat modification around those buildings today. And I'd like to say that with our guest speaker today, today's presentation is going to be intended to enhance your understanding of how to control for pests on the farm. And mostly today, we're going to be talking about in enclosed buildings. But this information does not fully reflect the FSMA produce safety rule, which is the curriculum that the University of Idaho Extension does rely on and teach. And so when you're trying to be compliant with your inspections that you could potentially be having, it's going to be really important to go back to the produce safety rule itself, the code, and read subpart L, so you know how to fully go about this and not just be relying on today's presentation. But with that being said, we do have a great guest speaker today. His name's Stephen Vantassel. He's with us today from the Montana Department of Agriculture, and he is a vertebrate pest specialist. And so with that being said, I'd like to thank him for being here and taking some time to teach us today, because it's going to be news for all of us in some ways. So with that being said, I'm going to pop off and give him the floor, and we're going to get going.
All right, well, thank you, Lou. Thank you, everyone. As we want to start sharing my screen, I guess, is how we're going to move forward here. Getting stuff set up. Let's see. Slideshow. All right, how are we looking there?
Gotcha.
Okay, sounds good. All right, yeah, so Lou's comments were very important because I am just learning about the FSMA rules. So for this presentation is going to focus primarily on some global things involved with pests, because a lot of people think that habitat modification and exclusion really aren't that effective. When people call me up and they say, Stephen, I have a problem with XYZ, we're always interested in how do we kill it. And certainly I'm happy to talk about that sort of thing. But when you're dealing with production like yourselves, we need to be thinking a little bit broader and start looking at ways to reduce the ability of these animals to become a problem in the first place. And so a rule of thumb I'm going to give you is, if you build it, they will come. If you remove it, they will go. Now, it's going to be hard in production because you're always going to have this massive food supply. But there are things we're going to talk about that can help. And I want you to get past the idea, well, that's too hard, that's not going to do anything. I call it the penny principle. Even small things can have an impact over time, particularly when you start looking at other type of lethal control measures, because habitat modification acts as a lever to magnify the effectiveness of other control methods. So let's talk a little bit about some biology here today. Want to make sure people can identify who the enemy is, because we want to be sure what we're dealing with. And so there's a lot of times confusion about various animals. So let's talk about voles, deer mice, and house mice. So voles, this is an animal that one way to identify it is look at the tail. Typically, the tail is going to be less than half the length of its body, and the ears are going to be much harder to find. Voles are not a problem in structures as a rule. Can you get them in structures? Yes, but it tends to be accidental. Deer mice, house mice, on the other hand, are commensal. Deer mice typically aren't treated as commensal, but they really are out here in the Northwest. Deer mice are everywhere, and we're going to talk about some health issues involved with deer mice. And so understand the differences between these. So if you're trapping a mouse, you want to take some time to look at it and say, is this a deer mouse or is this a house mouse? You want to get rid of both of them. Don't get me wrong. You want to get rid of both, but identification is important, because the deer mouse is associated with hantavirus, and that's going to be a concern. The deer mouse is also a much better climber than the house mouse. House mouse is a very good climber, but a deer mouse will travel a much greater distance to get to your structure than a house mouse will. So you're really looking at the tail. You want to see a bicolored tail. It looks brown at the top, but with a solid white line, and the belly is much more of a creamy white, where the house mouse has a much more grayer belly. And there's other information that you see there in your slide. Voles and shrews, these are another ones that people get confused on. The shrews will interstructure. They'll often create toilets that tend to stink really bad. They'll have very curved, curly type scat. But shrews are your friend. Not that you want them in your building, you don't, but they're actually insectivores. And so you can tell the difference. Notice the snout, very pointy, and they have teeth that are masticate, chew up the various insects that they're going after. And a vole, of course, is a rodent, so it has very much of the incisors. If I can get that picture out there, the two incisors that come down, notice the jaw is significantly different. So that's another area that people need to be able to identify. Not going to spend a lot of time here in biology. Let's bottom line it for you. House mice and deer mice reproduce pretty rapidly and aggressively. So you're not going to ever be able to sort of kill your way to prosperity. Killing is certainly an important role in pest control. However, you're never going to sort of get your way to victory that way. You've got to be looking at exclusion and habitat modification to really suppress those numbers over the long term. But I want you to focus on one thing here, and that's how little a house mouse needs to eat per day. I can't emphasize this enough. If you have a significant mouse problem, you've got to focus on the food. You've got to figure out ways. Where are you spilling grain? How are you storing your food properly? Are you keeping it in containers that can reduce access to mice? Now, I know that's going to be a difficult challenge for many of you in agricultural production. I get it. But again, I want you not to get complacent on this point, because every little bit helps. If you're able to remove that particular food source from a mouse, now you're going to make it more likely that other types of control methods that you're going to use are going to be more attractive to that mouse, because you're going to put stress on that mouse. And understand, the war against rodents never ends. You're either winning or you're losing. There is no détente. There is no peace treaty. There's nothing you can do here. It's never over. So if your goal here today is, say, Stephen, I want to be able to magically solve my mouse problem, well, here's the solution. Bulldoze everything and pave it. That will be the end of your rodent problems. Now, you're obviously going to be out of business, and that's very silly to do. Will that solve your rodent problem? Absolutely. You will have zero problems, but you won't have a business either. So understand, if you're going to be doing production, you're going to have rodent problems. It's just the nature of the beast. It's never going to end. It's like cutting your grass. People say, why should they keep trapping? It doesn't work. And I'll say, why do you cut your grass? It doesn't work. And then they'll finally get it, because nature is always reproducing something. So you have to be sure you're understanding that this war never ends. Let's talk about some home ranges. We have pack rat, of course. This is a radius range. These are home ranges, are sort of averages of how much space an animal sort of occupies as sort of their home territory. Doesn't mean they can't travel farther. They certainly can. There's been records of Norway rats going over a half a mile. However, on a normal situation, these are good rules of thumb to say, well, all right, where did that rat come from? Well, he could have rode the truck, or he could have come from the neighbor, because we all know that all of our problems in life come from our neighbors. So we always have to recognize that. And I hope you get the humor of that. But understand, mice can have a home range of just a couple of feet, depending if they have their nest very close to where the food source is. So these are the types of spaces you want to be thinking about in terms of managing your area. What's going on within 400 feet of your building? Because they could be living in your building and feeding somewhere else, or they could be living somewhere else and feeding in your building. And so you have to be making sure you're thinking about the landscape on your particular property, because you want to find out where they're living so you can attack that particular location. Understand the physical abilities of mice are incredible. And I want you to focus on one piece of data here. That's the standing jump. I want you to focus there. Notice how high they can jump. Now, a standing jump means going from one platform to another platform. Let me get both of my hands. So they're basically standing still and jumping straight up and onto another platform. Notice that the weakest mouse can jump almost 10 vertical inches. That's not a running jump. That's not a jump from an elevation. That is from one surface to a vertical surface. They can do it almost 10 inches. Imagine what the Michael Jordan mouse can do. If this is the weakest mouse, what can a Michael Jordan mouse do? So understand what they're capable of, and do not underestimate what they can do. Mouse droppings versus bat droppings. This can often be a confusing issue for people. So let's kind of break this down. People will call me up and they'll say, you know, I have some droppings out on my deck or in this particular area, and they keep reappearing. If you have that type of situation, 99% of the time, that's going to be a bat. Bats are going to be roosting in a particular area, and they're going to be defecating below where they're roosting, or they're entering the building, or exiting, when you're flying away, you need to lighten the load because you don't want to waste the energy. You're making a deposit right there as well. Bat droppings tend to be more rougher on the surface. And if you look carefully, don't touch. Poo is bad, don't touch that. So you want to make sure you're looking at it carefully. If you use a magnifying glass with a bright light, you should see speckles inside of it. And those are the exoskeletons of the insects that the bats are eating. Mouse droppings, on the other hand, tend to be smooth. They tend to be much smaller. And if you use a sort of a stick or a rock or something to touch them, they tend to be very hard when they're dry, where bat droppings, if you tap it, they'll crumble when they're dry. So, but mice droppings tend to be scattered. They tend to just simply go to the bathroom wherever they're moving around. So you'll see them in spot to spot. And this is something you need to be paying attention to when you're monitoring your particular area. You're wanting to look for droppings. Animals will tell you where they are. Other types of sign for mice, of course, this is where we have some insulation, this is a vertical view inside of an attic with blown in insulation. Notice where the trails, like a ping pong ball, got moved around the surface of that insulation. Here we have acorns on the upper right. Notice how the mouse that lacks the biting power of a tree squirrel that can just cut the acorn in half. It has to actually nibble through the end in order to get to the meat inside. And then, of course, you see some gnaw damage there as well. What are some of the risks with rodents? I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but it's not just simply infectious issues and food loss. They're also related to allergies, that people who are exposed to the proteins and dander of rodents over time can develop allergies. The research shows that people that work with lab rats and lab rodents for experimental purposes like new medication, typically in about 5 years, they're developing allergies to rodent dander at that point. So we want to be sure that not just for the disease factor, which is bad enough, and the contamination and for the consumption that they're doing, we need to recognize there's also dangers to you in terms of constant exposure to some of these allergens that you can become allergic as well. Other risks that you should be concerned about, because we want to talk about the protection of your structure and the investment that you have there, is that rodents, when they're left being for a while, will eventually start chewing your wires. And there is a percentage of fires that occur in the United States where they don't know what the cause is. They just sort of unknown, and they are related to rodent damage inside of that structure. Now, I wanted you to take a close look at the lower right-hand image. That is what happens when mice are released inside of a study area with fiberglass insulation. Notice how they riddle it with tunnels and trails. That occurred in about 6 months. So mice presence in your structure are also damaging the insulation capacity of your structure as well. So if you're wondering why the heating bill is going up, it may not just be because of rising fuel prices. It may be because rodents are working their way through the insulation of your structure. So there's other issues besides just simply disease and contamination that rodents are involved with. The lower left-hand photo is a picture of my car. This is where a mouse decided to take up residence there relatively quickly, in fact. And so they could even damage vehicles. And some of you, I'm sure, have stories about how mice have been on wires, and that certainly happens as well. So when we talk about integrated pest management, and I understand that's not the focus of this particular presentation, but we're going to be focusing today on the monitoring and the habitat modification. Too often, as I said earlier, we're always interested, how do we kill it? How do we kill it? How do we kill it? That's important, but it's only one leg of a three-legged stool. And we tend to avoid the habitat modification and the monitoring. Why? Because we're busy, we get distracted, we get tired of doing it, but we can't avoid those things, because otherwise we end up putting all this type of energy into control, when if we put a little bit of consistent energy into habitat modification and monitoring, we could have prevented the catastrophe with control. Let me tell you a little about my job. My job is basically trying to convince people to stop throwing money at problems and solve them sooner rather than waiting for a crisis. Now, I know that violates every belief we have as Americans. As Americans, we are built to wait till something becomes a crisis, and then we throw tons of money at it. Well, that's certainly how we do things in America, to be sure, but I'm saying there is a better way, and we're going to talk about some of those better ways here today, because you're not going to be able to simply kill your way to success when it comes to rodents. And birds are going to be another issue as well. We're going to talk about birds as well. So, but this principle of understanding habitat modification, which is changing the conditions that allow rodents to be there, and birds, monitoring so that we're acting when we see problems arise quickly rather than waiting for it to become a crisis. And then lastly, we're working at control, which is the physical elimination of that particular pest. That's the three-legged stool. Unfortunately, we focus far too much on the control rather than the habitat modification and the monitoring. This is what we're talking about when we deal with habitat modification. If you build it, they will come. If you remove it, they will go. Everything eats a mouse. Mice need structure in order to protect themselves from predators. So the more debris you have around your buildings, the more likely, the more attractive you're making that area for mice, because now they're able to go from cover to cover to cover and find their way into the building. What better place than a building that's heated, it's protected from the rain. Even if it's not heated, it's got protection from the rain, it's not blowing in the wind, and it has an easy access to food supplies. Get rid of as much debris as possible around your particular buildings. You want to eliminate food availability to the extent possible. I'm pointing out 3 ways here that we tend to forget about food access. We tend to think about our dumpsters. Now, one of the complaints I have with dumpsters is how often people don't close them properly. This is going to be an issue for birds when we get to our bird section. But here in the middle of the image, I want you to see how we have some grass plants that have gone to seed. That is food for rodents as well. So if you allow weeds around your building to grow up, understand that you are providing a ready-made food supply for rodents around your particular structure. So get the weed whacker out, or do a weed-free barrier around your structure that's even better to prevent weeds from coming up against the building, because that's not only providing cover, it's providing food. And then pets. Never have just food out for your pets just lying there. You want to feed them only what they can eat at one particular sitting, because not only are you going to be attractive to rodents, you're also going to be attractive to larger animals that are going to be beyond the scope of this particular presentation as well. This is what I'm referring to in terms of that weed-free zone. Here we have a McDonald's building. Granted, it's not one of your buildings to be sure, but notice they have all this stone around the structure. Now it's there for 2 reasons. One, it saves them from having to mow, but it also provides a weed-free barrier around the structure because rodents don't like to cross bare open areas. And if rodents are trying to cross that, it makes them more vulnerable to predation. So there's a psychological barrier to that. Plus, it saves you from having to weed whack that particular area. How about some other ways that animals get access to your structure? When we're dealing with rodents, people tend to always think of ground level. That's very appropriate. Rodents often come in at the ground level, but rodents are also highly capable climbers. So when we have scaffolding down at the right, when we have ivy on buildings, I call that rodent scaffolding, because the owner of the building obviously wanted to make it easier for rodents to access the structure. That's what you've done. You've also provided them cover, and you've given them a very easy ladder to climb. Now they can climb brick, not a problem, but why make it easier for them? How about trees? When you have overhanging trees on your structure, that also is an avenue for rodents to come in. Deer mice are exceptional climbers, so they can climb and get onto your building that way as well. So don't just simply think that rodents come into a building always at the ground level. They can come in at higher levels as well. So I want you to look high when we're dealing with an inspection. And how much of a gap are you looking for with rodents? 1/4 of an inch. Now I want you to take a moment, if you have a pencil nearby, and I want you to look at the thickness of that pencil. A mouse can get into a thickness smaller than the width of your pencil. That's how tight you need to view your particular structure. When was the last time you walked around your building and had a really good hard look? And you may need binoculars. You may need a bright light to be sure that all those dark areas. How about the brick there you see? Mice can climb that brick and squeeze in between the soffit and the brick. Where? Well, along the concrete gap where the concrete is put in between. Notice there's often a little curve there. Mice just squeeze in between the soffit and the concrete gap. They can get in through pipes, weep vents, ridge vents, and other soffit gaps. It doesn't take much. So you have to look high, and of course you have to look low. Pipe entries, garage doors, other types of vents, have you screened them? Now be careful of screening your dryer vents. That's going to be a problem. If you have an issue with that, we may need to have that in the question and answer time. But if you're dealing with vents that are moisture related, then that would be different. But if you're dealing with dryer vents that throw out particulate matter, be extraordinarily careful, because if you have a wrong screen on that, you can back it up, cause heat and then a fire with that sort of device. Be very careful of that. Some places it's actually illegal. Access doors are another key area that we have not secured properly. Why? Because it requires probably annual maintenance, and it's a pain. Let's face it. But you've got to go through the process to try to address that. How do we secure these openings? Well, we want to use sealants, not foam, sealants. We want to have something that's going to be flexible, because as your building moves and grows, meaning say, how does a building grow? Well, when the building gets heated up, things expand, and when the building cools down, things contract. So you need to use some proper sealants that will give as the building shifts over time. You want to use proper excluding products like excluder fabric, which is stainless steel embedded into plastic fiber, and it has a woven effect to it, so you can cut it. Make sure you're wearing gloves because those shards are very sharp. You also have copper stuff it, which is sort of like a copper sock that can be crunched up and wedged into holes. Why do I say these two things rather than steel wool? These objects don't rust. Don't use steel wool. Steel wool is going to rust, and then you're going to be back to square one again. And there you have a filled gap. To show you how easy this is, I want you to see how easy this is by looking at the video. Sorry you don't hear the sound, but just follow with it. Well, I hope you thought that was easy, because it is. That is the right way to secure those gaps around pipes. Now, does that solve all of your rodent entry problems? No. But again, we don't want to make the perfect the enemy of the good. And this is probably one of the biggest challenges people have. They're like, oh, I have so many gaps in my building, I shouldn't fix any of them. That is the wrong way to go about it, because you have to look at this as a process. If you can only do 5% of the gaps in your building this year, do the 5%. If you can only do another 5 next year, do that 5%. Because if you do the 5% this year correctly, that's going to last you for years. Do what you can when you can, and don't allow the perfect to be the enemy of the good in this situation. Don't allow the project to be so overwhelming that you get frustrated and discouraged. Do start. This is why you don't want to use expanding foam. Am I saying you should never use expanding foam? No, if you have massively large gaps that you need to fill, expanding foam may be what you need to use. However, understand it can be chewed through, and if it's exposed to UV light, it will degrade. So you want to be sure if you're using foam, you've got to protect it with something else, whether it be aluminum flashing or wood or something solid to protect it from getting gnawed through. Here we have a gap in the bottom. Notice the mouse is gnawed right through the foam. It gone into that opening. It was essentially a little bit more than using bubble gum as a way of locking the door to your house. How about frightening devices and repellents? People are always looking for magic in my business. And so let me kind of lay it out for you. There is no magic in wildlife control. It simply doesn't exist. I mean, it's sort of the equivalent of looking for a safe cigarette. Now, I just want to tell you that people don't believe me, but I want to assure you that if you buy one of these ultrasonic products, the best thing, it will work. It will repel $20 from your wallet. And if you call now, they'll send you 2, just pay extra shipping and handling. So it does work. It repels money from your wallet. Now, whether it will repel rodents from your structure, no. But you don't have to take my word for it. I'll still be here giving you other types of advice to you get to do that. The problem with repellents is what stops an animal from simply walking past it. Or if the wind blows a different direction, will they even know that it's there? Are you replacing it? Even the repellents that have some evidence to show that they work, are you reapplying them regularly? Probably not. So it's a huge problem. How about mothballs? Don't use mothballs. Mothballs are suspected carcinogen. They're for moths. They're supposed to be used in closed containers. If you're trying to protect clothing inside of a container, will it keep mice out? Probably. But it's a very highly concentrated gas, and in the closed container, the closed container should keep the mouse out in the first place. So these are not effective tools to be using. Plus, there's issues of off-label use of pesticides. How about trapping? Big fan of trapping. Unfortunately, most people, when they trap, do not use enough traps. Let me be kind of blunt here. Trapping is like money. More is better. So when people call me up for their homes and they'll say, I was trapping mice, but I can't seem to get ahead of them. And I'll ask them the question, how many dozen traps are you using? And they'll kind of say, well, I'm using 3. I'd recommend people use 24 traps for a 1,200 square foot house. So are you using enough traps? Probably not. Always make sure you're wearing gloves. It's not for odor issues. Animals are dirty. You don't know where they've been. You want to make sure you're protecting yourself. If the mice were afraid of human odor, they wouldn't be in the building. So we're not worried about human odor here. We're worried about protecting you from disease issues. So where do you place your traps? Rodents need heat. So you want to be thinking of your building, where are the sources for heat? This is where you want to start. Doesn't mean you can't have mice in a building that's not heated. You can. But you want to, if your building is heated, that's where the concentration of mice are going to be, because they're going to want to take advantage of that heat source. Because when you're that small, you lose heat very, very quickly, particularly in the winter time. And they want to reduce their calorie needs. And one way to do that is be closer to heat. So always be thinking about where heat is located. That's where you want to be looking for your traps in the sign. Always make sure you're using the right kind of traps. I trust all of you here are never, ever, ever going to be using so-called quote unquote live traps. They're actually box traps. I don't call them live traps, they're box traps. And you're not going to give this mouse a second chance, right? So I hope that's pretty clear. It should be a one-way trip. No second chances, no pardons here. It's a one-way trip. That mouse should never, ever, ever be coming back to your building if you're following what I'm saying. Okay. So what types of traps do you want to use? You can use the thin metal ones, triggers, but I'm going to tell you to use the expanded trigger, the one on the right. The expanded trigger, I understand it's a rat trap on the left, but I just wanted to show you what the metal trigger was. You always want to be using expanded triggers, and you always want to have enough fresh traps handy. Why? Because there's research that shows that when you catch a dominant male in a trap, there's a pheromone that's left behind that often will be repellent to female mice. So you may be catching a lot of mice. You're checking the gender of your mice, right? Because you should be catching about a 50-50, half male, half female, give or take. But if you're just catching males, that could be because that particular trap caught a dominant male, which is very attractive to lower males, but it can be repellent to females. Sorry, everyone, it's about the females when we're dealing with rodent control. That's where you want to put your effort. We want to make sure we're using proper setting technique. You always want your traps perpendicular to the wall with the bait area up against the wall. But if you can't do that because of lack of space, then you have to have one trap facing one direction, like at the bottom photo you see, where one bait is going the one direction and another one going the opposite direction, so that you can catch a mouse coming either direction. If you're in high traffic areas, you can always put snap traps inside of rat bait stations. A lot of them today are designed for various traps. Be sure you know the brand of the trap that will be useful, that will fit inside the bait stations that you're using. Or I'm sure many of you are handy enough, simply build boxes and cut holes in them and put the traps inside those boxes. That way the holes will allow the mice in, but will prevent other animals or people from getting in contact with those traps. Always pre-bait first if you're baiting. Pre-bait the traps. What do we mean by that? You'd have your traps positioned around your structure and you would not set them. You would simply bait them and leave them there. Come back the next day, rebait them again, the ones that need it. If you're seeing a lot of activity in the area, add more traps. Pre-bait. You want to go for several days like this. You want to get those mice conditioned to your traps. And then when you finally feel that you have enough activity and action and you think you have enough traps there, you set them all at once. That is going to be the most effective way of catching the most amount of mice in the fastest amount of time. We don't want to educate mice, which happens when you're setting your traps too quickly without getting them conditioned to the particular location. If you are using bait, here's some baits for you to try. Notice one of them's cotton and twine. You don't always have to use a food-based bait to attract animals. And if you're using the expanded trigger traps, understand that you have the ability to catch mice with a blind set. That is no bait at all, because you're positioning the trap up against a wall, and when the mouse comes along, he steps on the expanded trigger and gets caught without any bait whatsoever. You're simply relying on the normal movements of the mouse in that particular area. Glue boards, they're not all that great for rodents. In fact, that they found that with they're only good for catching juvenile rodents and bugs, because the larger rodents have their whiskers are out feeling away, and if they get educated to your glue boards, they just jump over them. So yeah, you may be catching juveniles because their whiskers aren't as far ahead of them, they're not as long, and they're just a lot more clumsy and dumb. But the adults will just keep providing you greater resources over time, and so they're really not that effective in controlling rodents. A lot of people in the Northwest, in our rural economies, think that cats are the end all and be all. Not true. Notice the mouse that's in this particular cat's mouth. Oh, well, I guess that's a bird. Yeah, well, and there's a bird that's not going to be inside your structure. Cats kill everything that they can find, and they're not that specific. Plus, you have the issue of Toxoplasma gondii, which is a parasite that's shed in the feces of cats. I encourage people, don't believe me, go on to Google Scholar. That's different than Google Scholar, and just put in the word toxoplasmosis and just look at the literature, say within the last 10 years. And if you're not scared by what you're reading, give me a call. I would be interested in finding out why you're not scared. So I'll just leave it there. So we want to talk about rodent control safety. We talked a little about wearing gloves. When we're dealing with deer mice, we have to be careful of high concentrations of their droppings because they shed a virus known as hantavirus. And so if you disturb those droppings and aerosolize that and breathe it in without proper protection, you can contract this dangerous disease known as hantavirus. It has about almost a 40% death rate for the people infected. That's with modern medicine, by the way. Okay, it's very, very deadly. Thankfully, it's not that common, but it's not unheard of. Montana is has one of the highest rates in the country, given our population size. So the point is when you see droppings like you see up in the upper right-hand corner, don't sweep that up. You want to be sure that you are going to treat that according to CDC guidelines. We're not going to go into a lot of detail here, but you want to wet all that down with a 10% bleach solution or with Lysol, let it sit, and then you're going to mop that up. But hopefully you're going to air the room out and you're going to wear other types of personal protection. But this is why this is such a deadly issue. And for those of you that are younger, you're actually more at risk because your immune response is stronger than those of us who are on the other side of the peak, so to speak. So this is the symptoms. It always starts off like the flu, and then you have this massive fluid buildup in your lungs with the immune response in your body. Your lungs here should be all black, not half white. That's because fluid is built up there. Very, very deadly. So protect yourself, wash your hands. This is a business. You wash your hands before you use the restroom, and hopefully afterwards as well, because animals are dirty. You don't know where that they have been. All right, let's transition over into some birds. Birds fall down into two basic categories. Unprotected birds, those are birds not protected by the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, and basically everything else. So it's relatively simple for you. Here are the 4 species of birds that do not have federal protection. Now, there may be local protections, there may be state protections. I doubt Idaho has protections for any of these 4 birds. I mean, if we were dealing with New York City, that would be a different situation, but my suspicion is your state doesn't care if you whack any of these 4 birds, okay? But all the other birds, you need a little bit more training on, because those would be federally protected birds. But these are the 4: starling, pigeon, house sparrow, and Eurasian collared dove. So house sparrows and starlings, they're crevice dwellers. They like to get into cracks and crevices to have a nest, and they'll fill them up with all the grass area. You can also see the signs of the droppings of where they are present. Pigeons are ledge dwellers. They will create a nest on a ledge. Basically, sometimes their nests are just nothing more than hardened feces. Other times they will have some sticks kind of roaming around, and they'll just plop a couple eggs on top of it. Pretty low maintenance. Now notice the owl effigy laying here on this other one. Notice notice the nesting birds up there? We have an owl effigy. Why do I put that in there? Because owl effigies are a cry for help. The person who put it up there doesn't realize they're crying for help, but owl effigies are a cry for help. So I hope that none of you are going to be relying too much on owl effigies. One of the challenges with birds, of course, is their droppings. And when the droppings are in sufficient quantity and are able to grow the fungus, it goes histoplasma, plasmata. I'm not going to give you the technical word for it here, but it creates an infection in our lungs if it becomes aerosolized. And so when we have the high enough concentrations of bird droppings and those get disturbed, this fungal spore can be released, and then we breathe it in, and then we get this massive lung infection that just doesn't seem to go away, because we literally have fungus growing in our lungs. And so it's pretty hard to treat as well. It's something we want to prevent. And there are instances, one where people have contracted it when someone was sweeping guano off of a roof, and people in the windows nearby contracted it. If you want to learn more about histoplasmosis and how to protect yourself, there's a government document available. It's not free. Our taxes paid for it. You just don't have to pay for it again. You can download this online. It's actually written very well. It's very understandable, and it's highly technical information that's accurate, that you can rely on about what histoplasmosis is, how to prevent it, and what you can do to clean up an area that has bird contamination at it. So feces of birds, pigeons, for example, can cause allergies as well. We saw that with the rodents. Well, the same thing can happen with birds. The constant exposure to the proteins in bird droppings can cause people to have allergic reactions. It's not histoplasmosis. It's where your body is just simply overreacting to the presence of those allergens. So the more you're exposed, the more likely you're going to get it. So this is another reason why we want birds away from our buildings. How about the safety issues of the amount of droppings involved? So notice how I'm trying to give you some other motivational factors for why you want to keep birds away from your buildings. If you have a situation where a lot of birds are on like a flat roof and they're pooping up there, and all of a sudden it rains and the droppings of those birds are clogging up your downspouts, all of a sudden you can have a rain incident, because now the rain's being backed up and you can have a roof collapse. This is not just something that's theoretical. It's actually happened in real time. How about the dry weight? What about situations where there is no water involved? Well, 40 pounds is equivalent to 1 cubic foot of bird droppings. So if you have birds constantly going into a building and there's a ledge there, they're just piling up feces, over time, you're going to have 40 pounds of droppings. That may not be much, but what happens if you start having a loft that you didn't screen off properly? What's that weight? Is the building designed for the weight at that particular point? I suspect it probably wasn't. So how do we make our area less friendly to birds? This is a lot harder than rodents because birds are so much more mobile, but there are things we can do in this regard. We want to make sure our dumpsters are closed. We want to make sure there's no free water available. So if you have areas on your parking lot that tend to pool water, you want to try to fill those as much as possible and level out your area, maybe have it sloped a little bit more, because pigeons need free water. And that's one way you can help reduce the attractiveness of the area. You want to be sure that no one on your property is feeding birds. Now, if you're looking to feed songbirds, I have a publication that's available for you. Just Google my name, Vantassel and Bird Feeder, that teaches you how to feed those birds and not the birds you don't want to be feeding. And then we want to make sure we're cleaning up any spilled grain that may be occurring. We want to think about landscape changes as well. Remember, water can pool on your roof as well, particularly if you have a flat roof. Is there pooling water there? Do you have an air exchange on your roof that's allowing that? Maybe you have an air conditioner up there that has a coolant drain up there that's providing free water. Grit is obviously a much more difficult thing to control. Grit is the sand that birds need in order to put into their crop to help grind their food up. If you can, anything to use larger stones so that the birds can't be attracted to simply coming around your driveway and parking lot areas. Again, are these cheap things to be doing? Not always, But if you can do them, to the extent that you can, you want to try to do them. And then with trees, a lot of birds like to loaf in trees that are very heavily leafed. You can trim the branches up to a third of those branches to kind of open up the canopy that makes that tree less attractive to birds being there. Those are long-term solutions to prevent the birds. Now they're going to be farther away from your structure rather than closer to your structure. We want to be sure we're removing their ability to enter the structure. This is something I've never quite understood about where I live in Montana, is that there's all these silos and grain buildings out there that all have broken windows, and no one took the time to take $5 worth of hardware cloth and simply close the door. I don't know why. It simply puzzles me to this day. Make sure you're not doing this. There's nothing cheaper than taking 1/4-inch hardware cloth and simply stapling it up over the opening. You're still allowing air movement, but you're preventing birds from getting access to the structure. Plastic strips can be used. These are a little pricey at times, but allows you to move equipment in and out of doors where you don't want to have to keep stopping, getting out of the vehicle, opening doors and closing them. Is it perfect for stopping birds? No, it's not, but it is substantially better than just simply an open door. That is something you definitely want to stop. Same way with vents, there's a variety of ways to seal off vents. Understand when you're closing off air vents, I'm not talking about dryer vents or things where debris is coming out. You want to be sure that you're doing it always from the outside of the building, not the inside. If you do it from the inside, you're actually creating a platform for a bird to make a nest. That is something you don't want to be doing. All chimney caps should be capped as well. And ideally, if you have a multiple flue chimney, you want to use a multiple flue cap. That prevents birds from sort of loafing on the top of your chimney as well. I can't overestimate and tell you how important habitat modification is. Research has shown if you would implement certain forms of habitat modification, you can basically cut the bird population in an area by 50%. Now, that's a big ask, depending if you do it thoroughly enough. However, it just shows you the power habitat modification can do to lowering the bird pressure on your particular building. So let's talk a little bit about bird pressure. We know we're covering a lot of ground here in a hurry, so I got a few more slides to go. Bird pressure is a term used for how attached birds are to a particular location. So the more attached the birds are to a location, the heavier the pressure is. Here's why it's important. Because by the time people call with a problem with birds, the birds are already attached to the building. That's why these frightening devices often don't work. That's why the owl effigies don't work, because the birds are already attached to the building. And most people, again, like good Americans, we always wait till it's a crisis because we believe that hard work may pay off in the end, but procrastination always pays now. And so we're going to take advantage of that. We're going to do the procrastination thing, and then if it becomes a problem, then we'll go deal with it. So light pressures, birds have just simply recently arrived. They don't have a permanent connection to the area, and there may be a place that's opportunistic for food and water. Medium pressure is where they're loafing, where they're able to sun themselves. Maybe they go feed somewhere and come to this particular location because the sunlight's really good. They're able to digest their food. They have a good view of the area where they're at. There may or may not be a permanent source of food. But then the last one is the most difficult, of course, is where they're nesting. Wherever you see nesting birds, that's heavy pressure by definition, because moving an animal from its nesting area is the most difficult. And again, we're talking about only these 4 species. Moving nesting birds of other species is a violation of the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. So let's talk about some of these frightening devices. I've already made fun of effigies. Do effigies work? Yeah, for about 2 or 3 days. Then you've got to move it, right? Other things, if you don't have heavy pressure or medium pressure at your buildings, you may try things like the eagle eye. There is some evidence to help keep them off of structures. It causes a flashing light and it spins. There's Reflectabird. You might have seen these on some of your Home Depots in your area. And then there's Irritape, which has an iridescence to it. So it has sort of a rainbow look, and it also flashes and crinkles and blows in the wind as well. Anything that has movement and sound and flashing lights is going to be better than something that's just stationary. So the best use of frightening devices is you got to use them before the birds begin to nest or habituate to the site. Here we have a barn swallow. It's too late for a frightening device for him because they're already nesting. Too late for that. Not going to work. How about spikes? Spikes are highly effective if you install them correctly. Here we have a failure here in the right where the birds are able to sort of get behind the spikes. You've got to follow the label instructions on how to use them correctly. Same way with netting. Netting is the platinum way of preventing birds from getting access to a particular area. But if you don't maintain it and have it secured properly, it's going to be a failure. So nothing is permanent. You have to be some things are long-term, but you've got to be sure you maintain them and make sure they're going to be in good repair over time. It's not something where you can just set and forget and it's done for the rest of your life. It's just simply not true. If you want to take things up a notch, you want to look at electric shock track. It's some impressive stuff happening here with electricity. They have even things that are solar powered, or you can plug them in a wall. Bird lands on it, it gets a pain shock response. And the beauty of that is even sometimes they've shown when the electric power was off, birds remember they got shocked over there and they still avoid the area. So it can be a very effective tool. It may seem expensive at first, but when you think about labor costs, it actually can be cheaper in some ways than actually using spikes, believe it or not. Trapping can be highly effective. It's also underutilized. There's single bird trapping, of course. I'm sure many of you are aware of air rifles and shotguns. There's also birth control for pigeons. That's called Ovo Control P. You can look that up yourself. It's a general use product. You don't have to have a license for that. But the problem is you have to wait for the birds to die off naturally. I encourage people to trap first, get the population down, and then follow up with Ovo Control. If you want to use a little bit something stronger, you have Avitrol. That's a restricted use product that uses a frightening way of scaring the birds away. Expect a little bit of mortality with that particular product. All right, we've covered a ton of information, but I hope if nothing else, you take away from this particular presentation the importance of habitat modification for reducing the pressure of vertebrate pests coming near your structures.
All righty. That was awesome. Thank you so much.
Okay.
I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen back up here. Okay, wow, that was great. I learned so much actually from that. So thank you so much for being here with us. So
Sure.
we have about 10 more minutes left. It looks like 9 more minutes. So that's perfect timing. We're gonna go ahead and move right into a little bit of a question and answer panel. First of all, we're going to go ahead and open this up to our participants and see if we have any questions from the audience based on anything you've encountered that has to do with pests on the farm or anything you saw in your presentation today. And then after that, we have a couple of questions that we can kind of throw up there if we don't get any from our general audience. So I'll give you guys just a sec. You can or I don't think you can unmute yourself, but you can put them in the chat if you have them, and I'll read it aloud. Or Ariel, I think you had a couple of questions that you received. If you want to go ahead and read one of those out.
Okay, in the chat. Okay, I was looking at the question and answer. All right, so let me go to the chat here. Okay.
And I can just read them out so that everyone hears them.
Oh, okay, great.
So I've got a few questions for you, Stephen. So I have greasy marks in the corners of my building. Is that a sign of a rodent infestation?
Yeah, that's called sebum. That's the body oils of the rodent. So yeah, that's going to be a hot spot that's a place where you'd want to make sure you're putting some of your traps. If you're using those, be sure you pre-bait them first. But that would be a hot spot for using your traps. You may be able to blind set there.
Okay.
But if you're getting a lot of sebum, that's either if it's mice, it's heavy activity, or you might have rats. I didn't talk a lot about rats in this presentation because if you have rats, you have mice. So most people have mouse problems. And if you're getting to rats, that's taking things up to another level.
Great, thank you. Another one is often when we're teaching the Produce Safety Alliance curriculum, we talk about not baiting traps indoors for, we don't want to entice these rodents indoors. So what would you say is the efficacy of an unbaited versus a baited trap?
All based on location. The unbaited traps are called blind sets. So you would be relying on the movement of the animals. So if you have a pinch point, maybe where you see a gap in a wall where a mouse has been squeezing through another rodent, you can actually create a barrier. So let me try to do a picture for you here. So here, if we have a wall, if that's showing up, oh, maybe not, maybe do it here. We have a wall, and we're going to make this my trap. So if you have a wall, you can sometimes create another barrier and create a funnel so that the rodents are moving through the wall. Then you can put your traps inside that to kind of funnel them for you. You can also use non-food baits. So I'm learning about FSMA myself, so I'm learning the FSMA side of things. So you can use things like cotton or twine. That would be attractive to mice because they would want to use that as bedding material. And so there you're not having a food item to attract them, to attract other rodents, but you're using something that they would want to grab and use in their nest.
Very interesting and very helpful. Thank you. And then I've got one more for you, and then I've got a couple for Casey, and then one that I think you both might answer from different
Hey,
perspectives.
Ariel,
Yes.
we have a couple of questions in the chat as well, just so you know.
Okay, I'll make sure to get to those. What is a good width for a bare ground buffer around a building that would deter rodents?
This is going to be a wiggle answer, as big as you can get it. So ideally you'd want something out, 3 feet would probably be reasonable, but if you can go 10 feet, 11 feet, bigger is better in that sort of situation. But I understand that's not practical all the time, but 3 feet would probably be a reasonable start.
Okay. And then here's another spacing question. How far apart do you think traps should be placed inside a building and outside a building?
Are you using it for monitoring or are you using it for control? Because if it's for monitoring, I'd probably put one every 30 feet or so, but I wouldn't focus on it at a grid pattern. There's often, you want to put the traps where the mice are going to be. Mice are not going to be moving in areas where they're exposed. So if you're putting your traps and your knees aren't hurting and your back because you're twisting behind and trying to put things behind objects where mice are going to be, then that's how you're supposed to be baiting. But if it's too easy for you to trap, you're not doing it right. So in terms of spacing, you want to base it on the situation of concentration of how heavy your density is going to be. So on the exterior of the building, I would want at least some tin cats or multiple catch mouse traps at least at every corner. So that would be, I would want at least 4, if not 8, 2 on each side at the corners. So you're catching rodents as they're moving along the exterior of your building. Those are multiple catch traps is what I would use out there. And then inside I would use some of the others. So the spacing would be based on what the density is of mice in your area, or at least 1 every 10 feet.
That's really helpful information. Thank you. Okay, last one for you, Stephen, so far. This participant has birds on telephone wires that are directly over their driveway, but not close to our garage. And I'm guessing the garage is where they're doing some of these activities. Should I hose off my driveway?
Yeah, that shouldn't be a problem because because driveways aren't organic. Typically, I'm assuming it's a paved driveway and not like a dirt driveway or a gravel driveway. If it's a paved driveway, histo is very hard to grow there because there's not enough organic material for it to be there. I'm not even sure I would bother even hosing it unless the concentration was exceedingly great. There are, because I don't want you doing anything around power lines in that situation, depending what type of bird it is, you may be able to start trapping some of those birds.
Great. Okay, I've got, I thought I was done, but no, I've got 2 more questions for you, and they both relate to traps. The first one is, let's see, when using the Victor snap traps, are they made for single use?
No, I would reuse them.
Okay.
Trappers, we don't like to throw stuff away. So I would definitely reuse them. Just always make sure you have a few fresh ones. And that doesn't mean necessarily new. It just means that they're quote unquote clean, and that if you've caught a bunch of rodents with it, you may want to have some that you would just put aside, maybe put them outdoors, let them weather a little bit more, and let the pheromones move off. So that way they're clean, because dominant male mice that are caught are going to be repellent to females. So that way, if you're having a little bit of trouble, you might want to swap in some new traps occasionally that don't have those pheromones on it.
Great tip. All right, and then this one, I'm not sure, maybe you have an idea of the type of structure they're talking about, but it says, hi, I have been avoiding baits in exterior stations in fear of affecting non-targeted pests. I'm having birds enter the stations and get caught in the snap traps. The devices are decorative rock style with bricks at the bottom. They sit a little higher than normal. Should I dig these lower, or do you have any other suggestions?
Or if the person's not controlling for rats, this is one of my pet peeves. I've begged manufacturers to change their rodent stations. The rodent stations are designed for rats, but most of us don't have rats. We have mice. And so the problem is that the opening is too large. So the opening is probably 2.5 inches wide. You only need an opening an inch wide for mice, maybe 1.5 inches if you're a little nerve, maybe your mice are fatter than all the other mice, right? So that would be one thing I would do, is I would narrow down that opening. And if you can lower it closer to the ground, that would work as well, because obviously you don't want birds getting in there. So something that sounds pretty high for the birds to be getting in there. I haven't heard of birds, but certainly other animals can get in there. So you are correct to be concerned. Secondary poisoning with rodenticides is an issue.
Right.
Without a doubt.
And I've got one last question for you. It looks like we have time just for this one last one. If the snap trap has the male pheromone on it, is there a way to decontaminate it or remove that odor?
I would just, yeah, put it outside, let it stay there for several days. Some people go as far as washing them. You know, that's life's too short. And the paramiscus question, paramiscus is just a scientific name for deer mice and white-footed mouse.
Wonderful. So those were the only questions from the attendees for our speaker presenter. That's all I've got.
Yeah, there you go. Okay.
Is it showing my last slide now? It's kind of giving me a hard time on my end. Shoot. Okay. Well, it's not working on my end to get back into here. Well, anyway, so I guess that's all that we have for today. We have a couple more questions that didn't get answered, but I'll send answers to those in my follow-up email just for the sake of time, so we can get everybody out of here on time. I do have one more slide, but it's not popping up for me. Basically, it just says that we do have 2 more webinars coming up this month. We have one not next week, but the week after that. We have them on the two remaining Tuesdays of the month in April. I'm gonna be sending out information on that as well. And then, like I said, if you guys have any more questions, I will get those answers out today, as well as a recording of this webinar and also a slide deck of all the slides we went through today and the questions that we did. But thank you so much for being here, and thank you, Stephen, for joining us today. This was an awesome presentation.
Thank you, everybody. Appreciate the kindness.
Thank you, Stephen.
Take care, Casey.